There is a collection of photographs from the 1800s that most people have never seen. Not because they were lost to time, but because they quietly disappeared from public conversation, tucked away in archives. Dismissed as curiosities or labeled as fabrications before anyone seriously asked what they actually show. In these images, groups of men in formal clothing stand beside enormous skeletal remains. Bones so large that they stretch beyond the height of a grown adult. Skulls that require multiple people to lift. Femurs that look less like human anatomy and more like something pulled from a myth, yet the setting is unmistakably real. Often marked by excavation tools, measuring sticks, and the composed posture of professionals who appear to be documenting a discovery rather than staging a spectacle. At first glance, it is easy to assume these images are manipulated, especially through a modern lens where digital editing is effortless and misinformation spreads quickly. But these photographs originate from a time when creating convincing visual hoaxes required far more effort, coordination, and intent, raising an uncomfortable question that lingers beneath the surface: if these were fakes, WHO made them, and more importantly, why do they appear in multiple locations across different decades with consistent visual patterns that suggest something more than isolated trickery? Some of these images were even published in early newspapers and scientific bulletins, accompanied by brief descriptions that hint at discoveries too unusual to fully explain. Yet, over time, references to these findings became scarce, as if the narrative surrounding them was gradually edited, simplified, or intentionally redirected toward more conventional interpretations of history and human evolution. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the late 19th century was not just a period of industrial growth and scientific curiosity, but also an era where institutions began consolidating authority over knowledge, defining what would be accepted as legitimate science and what would be discarded as myth, folklore, or error. So when we look at these photographs today, we are not just looking at strange images of oversized skeletons. We are stepping into a deeper question about how history is recorded, who decides what is preserved, and whether some discoveries, no matter how real they may have seemed at the time, were simply too disruptive to fit within the emerging framework of modern science. Because if even a fraction of these images reflect something genuine, then the implications extend far beyond a few forgotten photographs, challenging our assumptions about the past, the limits of human variation, and the possibility that parts of our history were not erased by accident, but quietly set aside. And once you begin to examine these images closely, one detail after another starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern waiting to be understood. When you begin to examine these photographs more carefully, something unexpected starts to emerge, not just in the size of the bones, but in the consistency of how these discoveries were documented, as if different excavation sites, separated by geography and time, were following a similar visual language without ever coordinating with one another. In many of these images, the skeletal remains are positioned in partially unearthed pits surrounded by men dressed in suits, hats, and boots typical of the late 1800s, holding shovels or standing with measuring rods, their posture composed and deliberate, suggesting that the moment being captured was not chaotic or accidental, but instead part of a process, a record of something that was meant to be observed, catalogued, and possibly studied further. The scale, however, is what disrupts everything, because the bones do not simply appear large. They appear proportionally consistent with human anatomy, yet magnified to a degree that challenges what we understand about biological limits. With skulls that maintain recognizable structure, eye sockets aligned as expected, jawlines intact, and limbs that follow the same ratios found in modern human skeletons, only extended far beyond what conventional science would consider possible. What makes this even more difficult to dismiss outright is the repetition of specific details across multiple photographs, including the presence of excavation teams posing beside the remains in ways that emphasize scale. The careful clearing of surrounding soil rather than rough extraction, and the apparent absence of theatrical exaggeration that would typically accompany a staged hoax designed to attract attention or disbelief. Some images include handwritten notes, markers, or early forms of labeling that suggest these sites were being recorded with a level of seriousness, even if the context around them was never fully developed or widely circulated, while others appear in publications that treat the discovery briefly, almost cautiously, before shifting focus to more conventional findings. As these photographs circulated in limited circles, they began to take on a strange dual identity, where some viewers saw them as evidence of something extraordinary, while others dismissed them as misinterpretations, optical illusions, or deliberate fabricants, and over time, the latter explanation became dominant not necessarily because it was proven, but because it aligned more comfortably with the existing framework of human history. And yet, when you place several of these images side by side, the similarities become harder to ignore, not because they prove anything definitively, but because they suggest that whatever was being documented followed patterns that are difficult to replicate convincingly, without a shared intent or a shared reality behind them. It is in these patterns that the real mystery begins to take shape, because they raise a question that goes beyond whether the skeletons were real or fake, and instead focuses on something more subtle and more unsettling. Why do so many of these images look like they were never meant to be questioned in the first place? If they were hoaxes, they were unusually restrained, almost understated, lacking the dramatic flair that typically accompanies deception, and if they were genuine discoveries, then the quiet way they faded from mainstream discussion becomes even more difficult to explain. Right after this point in the story, it is worth remembering that if you find this kind of deep, investigative breakdown interesting, following the channel helps you keep up with future analyses that explore overlooked details like these, always with the goal of separating assumption from evidence without forcing conclusions. Because in the next part, the focus shifts away from the images themselves and toward the context in which they appeared. And that is where the timeline begins to reveal something even more intriguing. To understand why these photographs appeared, and perhaps more importantly why they faded, it is necessary to look closely at the period in which they were taken. Because the late 1800s was not just an age of discovery, but a moment when the foundations of modern science were being solidified, often through processes that favored consistency over contradiction. During this time, fields like archaeology and anthropology were rapidly evolving, moving away from scattered exploration and into more structured, institutional frameworks, where universities, museums, and scientific societies began establishing standards for what constituted valid evidence, acceptable interpretation, and credible publication, creating a system that rewarded alignment and quietly filtered out anomalies that could not be easily explained. At the same time, there was a surge in excavation activity across North America and parts of Europe, driven by both scientific curiosity and national interest, as newly formed institutions sought to build narratives about human origins, migration, and development, often tying these narratives to identity, progress, and cultural legitimacy. It was within this environment that reports of unusually large skeletal remains occasionally surfaced, sometimes mentioned briefly in local newspapers, sometimes referenced in letters or field notes, and sometimes accompanied by images that appeared to document the discovery, yet these reports rarely received sustained attention. And even when they did, the conclusions were often tentative, quickly redirected, or left unresolved. One factor that complicates this further is the presence of organizations during that era that were deeply invested in shaping archaeological interpretation, including groups like the Smithsonian Institution, which played a significant role in collecting artifacts, funding expeditions, and ultimately influencing which findings were preserved, studied, or displayed to the public. This does not imply a coordinated effort to conceal specific discoveries, but it does highlight the reality that centralized authority over knowledge naturally leads to selective emphasis, where certain narratives are reinforced while others are minimized, especially if those outlying discoveries challenge the emerging consensus about human evolution and biological limits. Additionally, the technological limitations of the time meant that documentation was often sparse, inconsistent, and vulnerable to reinterpretation, allowing later generations to revisit earlier findings with a more skeptical lens, sometimes dismissing them entirely without fully re-examining the original context in which they were recorded. There is also the cultural layer to consider, because folklore and myth were still deeply intertwined with early scientific exploration, and reports of giants, unusual beings, or oversized remains were often filtered through a lens that blurred the line between observation and storytelling, making it easier for later scholars to categorize such findings as exaggeration rather than investigate them as potential anomalies. And yet, despite all these factors, the photographs remain not as definitive proof of anything, but as artifacts of a moment in history when the boundaries of knowledge were still being negotiated, and when certain discoveries, whether misunderstood or inconvenient, may have quietly slipped through the cracks of official narratives. As we move forward, the focus shifts from the context to the possible explanations. Because once you accept that these images existed within a complex and selective historical framework, the next question becomes unavoidable. What are the most plausible ways to interpret what they show? Once the images and their historical context are placed side by side, the instinct to jump toward a single explanation becomes less convincing, because what we are dealing with is not one photograph, not one report, but a cluster of visual and textual fragments that can be interpreted in multiple ways, each carrying its own strengths, limitations, and unanswered questions. The most grounded explanation begins with the possibility of misidentification, where large bones discovered during excavations may not have been human at all, but rather belong to prehistoric animals, such as mastodons or other megafauna, whose skeletal structures, when partially exposed and viewed without full context, could resemble oversized human remains to observers who were still developing comparative anatomical knowledge. Closely related to this is the idea of early scientific era, which was not uncommon in a period when classification systems were still evolving, and where enthusiasm for discovery sometimes outpaced verification, leading to conclusions that were later corrected or quietly abandoned as the scientific method became more rigorous and standardized. Another explanation moves into the realm of intentional fabrication, but not necessarily in the way modern audiences might imagine, because hoaxes in the 19th century were often created for local attention, exhibition, or curiosity rather than global deception, and while some famous cases did involve constructed skeletons, many of those hoaxes were far more theatrical and sensational than the restrained, almost procedural tone seen in these photographs. Then there is the possibility of composite imagery or early manipulation, where photographs may have been altered through techniques available at the time, such as double exposure, staged perspective, or physical models integrated into the scene, although replicating the anatomical consistency and scale across multiple independent images would require a level of coordination that raises as many questions as it answers. Beyond these conventional explanations lies a more speculative territory, where some suggest the existence of unknown variations of human size or even lost populations that exhibited extreme physical traits, an idea that resonates with ancient myths and cultural records from various parts of the world, yet remains unsupported by widely accepted scientific evidence in the present day. What makes this spectrum of explanations particularly compelling is not that any one of them fully resolves the mystery, but that each leaves behind gaps, small inconsistencies that prevent a clean conclusion. Whether it is the lack of definitive documentation, the disappearance of original specimens, or the visual coherence of the photographs themselves. In reality, the most responsible position may not be to choose one explanation and dismiss the others, but to recognize that these images exist at the intersection of evolving science, limited documentation, and human interpretation, a space where certainty is difficult to achieve and where assumptions can easily harden into conclusions without sufficient scrutiny. And perhaps the most important shift at this stage is not asking which explanation is correct, but asking which questions have not been fully explored, because it is often in those overlooked gaps that the most meaningful insights begin to emerge. As we approach the final part of this investigation, what matters most is not proving a theory, but understanding what these photographs reveal about how we interpret evidence, construct narratives, and decide what is worth remembering. As the decades passed and scientific disciplines became more structured, something subtle but significant began to happen to reports like these. Not through a dramatic act of suppression, but through a gradual process of omission, reinterpretation, and silence that is much harder to trace, yet often more effective in shaping long-term perception. Many of the original excavation sites were either reclassified, repurposed, or simply lost to time, while the physical remains that might have clarified these discoveries were rarely preserved, with the level of documentation required for future verification, leaving behind a fragmented trail where photographs exist without specimens, and reports exist without follow-up analysis. In some cases, references to unusual skeletal finds appear briefly in local archives or early publications, only to vanish in later summaries, as if the initial observation was absorbed into a broader narrative that no longer had space for anomalies, especially as scientific consensus began to favor a more uniform understanding of human biological limits. What remains particularly striking is not just the absence of definitive proof, but the absence of sustained curiosity, because in a field driven by discovery, one would expect even controversial findings to be revisited, debated, or challenged over time. Yet many of these cases seem to have been quietly set aside, receiving neither confirmation nor thorough debunking. This pattern raises an important consideration about how knowledge evolves, because information does not need to be actively hidden to become inaccessible. It only needs to be deprioritized, archived without emphasis, or reframed in a way that removes its original significance, allowing future generations to overlook it without ever realizing it was there. At the same time, the surviving photographs continue to circulate, often detached from their original context, which creates a different kind of problem, where images are interpreted without the supporting data that would either validate or disprove them, leading to a cycle where belief and skepticism reinforce each other without resolution. And yet, despite all of this uncertainty, the persistence of these images suggests that whatever they represent, whether misunderstanding, manipulation, or something not yet fully explained, they were once considered real enough to document, real enough to photograph, and real enough to momentarily enter the historical record. Which brings us to a final, unavoidable reflection, not about giants or hidden truths, but about the nature of history itself. Because what we accept as fact is often shaped as much by what is preserved as by what is forgotten. And sometimes the most intriguing questions are not the ones with clear answers, but the ones that were never fully pursued. So, when you look at these photographs today, the question is no longer just what they show, but what they represent in a broader sense. Are they remnants of misinterpretation, artifacts of early experimentation, or fragments of a narrative that was never completely told? And more importantly, if similar discoveries were made today, documented with modern technology and global visibility, would they be investigated more deeply, or would they still struggle to fit within the boundaries of what we are prepared to accept as possible? Because in the end, the mystery of these images may not lie in the bones themselves, but in the quiet space between discovery and explanation, where some stories begin and others simply fade.